To put this into practice, we need to actually write some PHP. So we're finally back to where we're coding in Atom and working through one of these examples. I've just pulled down the basic example. I've renamed it index.php instead of .html. Don't forget to do that or it won't interpret your PHP. And then I've just filled in the basic information throughout it. Now for this particular example, we're going to be working with a simplified version of that movie database that you saw before. Let me show you what it looks like. It is a single table. Now, of course, there's no reason it has to be a single table, but I don't want the database to be complex here. The more complex it is, the more difficulties we might run into as we try and work with this. So we keep our table simple, our database simple, in the hopes that we can focus on the PHP part. What does it have? Well, it has an ID for every movie. It has title, year, and rated, which is the actual MPAA rating. It has the IMDb rating. It has a description. It has an image, which is the poster that goes with it. And then it has genres, which is unique. It's the image, genres, directors, writers, and actors are all unique. Those weren't there before. So the rest of these were there in the table before. But because these are all in a nice flat table that we can work with, it's going to keep our queries nice and simple. We want to focus on the PHP part. That's why we do that. We might come back to this from time to time just to make sure we're querying the right things, but that's what that looks like. So in order to actually move forward and do something with this, we need to write some PHP. Let's go right in here and get ourselves into PHP land. And we need to basically go through those 5 steps that we talked about and pull out some information. So let's do that. I want to bring them in here. So we can even just copy these right into our code and turn those into comments so that we can go through the steps one by one. So 1, we're going to connect to the database. 2, we're going to prepare the query. That's probably the most complex step. 3, we're going to run the query. 4, we're going to bind the results to variables. And finally 5, we're going to fetch the actual results. And that's when we finally get our data out of all of this. So let's come back over here and we'll work through these examples so that we can see exactly how they build up with a specific database in mind. So step 1, connect to the database. We need to create the MySQLi object and check for errors. So that's going to look like this. So we declare a variable that we're going to be using a lot from here on out called db, and that's going to equal mysqli, new mysqli. And then we pass into it all the information we need, including the host, the user, the password, and the database name. So here's the data that we will actually be using this time. I'm going to put both of these down on the next line. The host is that one where we were running our examples, 144.13.2259. The username is web user, which is something that's been specifically created for us to access this. It's a very restricted account that can only run select statements, so it won't be allowed to do anything malicious that actually modifies the data. The password is this big complicated thing. This is actually what's called a UUID, which is just something I like to use when we create complicated passwords that are not meant for human consumption. Notice that it is written right into the page in plain text. This is the nature of it. And so index.php that we're using here should never be exposed to the user. As long as the PHP always gets run and interpreted, it never would be, but it is important to keep that in mind. This is a very common thing that happens. It's also another reason that these particular accounts should not be allowed to do much, because if this password were actually found somehow, they could get in and use it any way they want and run any queries that they want. Lastly, the name of the database is called MyFlix2. That's because it's the 2nd generation of the MyFlix database. So this is how we actually establish the connection. The next thing we need to do is check for errors. And you can see here we can check db connect error no. And if that's defined, if $db connect error no, error number, and it should be ERRNO, then something has gone wrong and we should echo out a warning. In this case, we will say echo, and we'll say error or connection error. And let's go ahead and put it inside of HTML too, so that it's as nicely formatted as possible. Remember, we are echoing out to the HTML page itself. And we can even put like a strong here around the connection error part. And then let's put the actual message, and that's going to be $db connect error this time. And then we'll close out the p tag and put in a new line. So there we go. This will allow us to actually get connected. Let's save this and let's see what happens. Here we go. So we did actually get an error here. We got connection error. Access denied for web user at parentheses, where that's just any particular database, or where we're coming from any particular host, to database myflix2. Now, if you see any sort of error like this where it says access denied, make sure you double check your username, your password, and that you're using the exact ones that I gave you to use. If you do all of that and you find you still can't, and also, of course, your database name. If you do all of that and you find you still can't connect, that may mean that the error is on my end and you should contact me about it. So this was a case where it turns out I had not given the permission to access that yet. In fact, it looked something like this. It was only allowing access to a restricted number of databases, and myflix2 was not included. So if I go to web user coming from anywhere, that's what this means, I've now added myflix2 with only select privileges, so it can only run select queries. That should make it a fairly innocuous thing. Let's see now if we save this, if that error message goes away. And it does. So now our connection was successful, or we assume it was because no error was reported. Now we're ready for step 2, to prepare the actual query. Well, what do we want to query here? Let's go ahead and write our query. This is something that I find is actually handy about Atom. It's going to recognize that we're trying to write a query here as soon as we put in the word select. It's like, oh, that's SQL. So you'll see here it does do some reasonable syntax highlighting. Let's pull out the title and rating of all movies from the movie table, where the rating equals, what should we say here? Let's say PG. So we're going to pull out all PG movies. That'll be our query. And we're keeping it really simple right now. We don't want to put any sort of variable in there yet. Let's see how we do the rest of this. Initially, you just write your query in as a string, just like we did before. Then we need to prepare the query. So we're going to call db prepare and pass it the query. So $db prepare, and you want to make sure basically you use whatever variable you named it as up here. That's the key thing. But if you're following my example, it'll always be that. Prepare and then give it the query. You could actually type that query right in line here if you want to, but I've found more than one time I really wanted it to be in its own line because it got complicated. This is going to return something. It's going to return our statement object. So we need to receive it into that variable stmt for our statement. Then we need to check it. If not statement, so if statement is not valid, then we need to say what sort of error we have here. So let's say echo. I'm actually going to come up and copy this line because we're going to do our errors in a similar way every time. We'll say query error. And then we would say db error this time, because this isn't a connection error, it's just a general error that happened when we ran db prepare. So let's save that and see what happens. Query error, table myflix2.movie doesn't exist. Well, let's see what it is actually called. Luckily, I have the schema all pulled up over here, and we can take a look at that. What is the actual schema? If we close out of this and go back to our little no, it's not that one, it's myflix2. It's movies with an S. So let's change that from movies and see if that doesn't fix the situation. Unknown column rating in the field list. So I need to look at this a little more seriously here. Rated is what it is. So we do have title and rated. Those are the things that I'm doing. So R-A-T-E-D, and then also over here, R-A-T-E-D. Save that. And there we go. The errors went away. All right. Now, if we were doing this in a little more robust sort of way, this is unsafe, we would have a parameter that we were dealing with that we would need to edit out. In this case, we don't have that. We'll come back and do one where we do, though, later, so you see the full execution. But if your query is just fully defined, like this is, all PG movies, and there's no variables being used, this is perfectly safe. So that means for now we can move on to step 3. For step 3, we need to actually execute the statement. Let's move past the sanitized version. So we're going to call execute on the statement, and as always, check for errors. So we run this as if not, not stmt, $ stmt, excuse me, execute, and that actually runs the query. Then we would once again put out an error. And so we would say query, we'll call it execution error. And then here we would say stmt error this time, because it was statement that actually ran the function. So the error will be on the statement object. That's all we have to do for this one. Now we need to bind the results to variables. This also involves fetching, or excuse me, saving the results. So let's come back here, look at the examples again. So step 4, bind the results to variables. We use store to actually store them locally, and then we do bind result. So here we go. Statement store result is actually store result. I have an error there. Arrow store result. And then, once we've stored the result, we can check that there's something in there. So if $stmt-num rows is less than 1, something's wrong. And we would want to let them know. We would echo error, and then we would say something to the effect of no rows returned. We expect some rows to be returned or something is wrong. So the results are now stored. We checked that they actually got some rows back, and we can see here we're not getting that error here, so we can assume that it actually did execute okay and that we got some rows back. Why don't we, in fact, print out how many rows we got back? So let's see, echo, we'll do a P here, and we'll say $stmt-num rows returned. Nice and simple. So we can see exactly how many rows we do get back from this. How many PG movies are there? Save. 71. 71 PG movies in there. Yeah, they like to be a little more racy with their Best Picture nominees, don't they? All right. We're not done with the binding the results to variables yet. All we did was store the results. Now we need to actually bind them. And that statement is bind result. So we say if not, because we're always checking for errors, stmt bind result. This is different from the original bind. Up here we had bind param, which we didn't need this time, but this one's bind result. And then we give it variables for every result we're going to get, title and rate it. So we would say $, I'm going to say movie title, and then $ movie rated. Now, movie rated should be PG everywhere, so maybe it isn't information we need, but we're still going to bind it. So if that doesn't work, then we'll echo out some sort of error here. We'll say error, we'll say a binding error, and then we would output the error message this time, stmt error, whatever it said. All right, so now that the results have been stored, the statement has been bound, we are now ready to fetch the results. So for that, we're going to call stmt fetch with no parameters. This is a function that simply grabs the next row and puts its data into movie title and movie rated. And we're going to have several. So we're going to say while statement fetch, and we're going to keep going through and echoing out the information. Now here's where we need to give it a little bit of structure. Let's create for ourselves a UL. So let's say unordered list. We'll give it the class list group. And we only want to output the opening one for right now. And then inside here, we'll output echo li, and we'll give it the class list group item. And then what info do we give it? We'll give it the movie title. And then in parentheses, we can give movie rated /n. And then finally, we close it up, echo /ul. And this happens after the loop has finished running. So this loop is going to run as long as there's data to fetch. It will keep fetching it. We keep outputting the latest title and rated until it returns false. Then we close out the unordered list. And we can tab this in one notch here. Let's go ahead and save this and see what we get. Oh, we caused an error. We have an error in our PHP somewhere. And the first thing I always do is check for semicolons, because that's my notorious problem. And looky right here, we're missing one. I always miss the semicolons. Refresh. Hey, there we go. So here are all of our PG movies. So The Adventures of Robin Hood was PG, Casablanca, Love Story, Cabaret was PG. Oh my. The Sting was PG. Oof. Jaws was PG. So yeah, here's all the PG movies that have ever been nominated for an Academy Award. Yeah, somehow a Stanley Kubrick movie got rated PG. All right, now let's go ahead. There's usually one last thing we need to do before all is said and done. I didn't mention this over in the slides, but it's something that you can actually leave out if you really want to, but it's good practice. We are now done with this statement, and that means that we really should close it off. We don't need this connection anymore, so usually call close. And in fact, I'm completely done with the database, so I would close out my connection with the database as well. Now, if you don't do that, you have the potential to create what's called a resource leak. You're holding on to a resource in a way that you don't need to anymore. Now, very often those just go away once the PHP finishes executing, but it's usually bad practice to assume it will be cleaned up for you. So always close them out. And we close the statement first and then the database. And that then gets us in a situation where we've let go of any resources we might have been holding on to. All right, hopefully this all makes sense. Let's go back and modify this ever so slightly to make it a little more complicated, because why not? Here when we do the query, let's actually do it based on some data that the user can set. So to do that, let's create an input. I'm going to create an input type equals text, and we'll say name equals rating, like that. And we'll just put that in there and save it. And there it is right there. And so the user could come here and type in, say, R or PG. And so they're able to actually type in the particular rating they want to look up. I'm going to put a line break in there. Now this is ugly. Normally we would not want to leave all this like this, but yeah, that's how it is. I guess the line break wasn't needed, but it doesn't really matter. So let's go ahead and work with this and see if we can allow the user to be able to select the rating. Now we should do a couple other things here. Let's go and put this inside of a form. And we'll say that the action for the form, or let's say, we'll do two different things here. We'll say that the method equals post, and the action we're actually going to leave off. Now remember, action would normally be the page that you send it to. If you leave the action off, it actually happens on the current page. It submits to itself method. So that basically means please just submit to myself. Now let's also create a button here. Type equals submit, class equals btn, default. And then call it submit. And so now we've got our submit button right there that we can click, which causes this to submit back to itself. And now the data that was in these is posted. So what do we do down here? We want to grab that post data. And so we would then create a variable. So just as an extra step here, in fact, before we ever connect to the DB, let's say grab posted data. And so you remember from last section how this works. We would basically say if is set $_post, and the data I actually want to grab is called rating. If it's set, then we'll go through and do all of this. But if it's not set, we're not going to do any of this. All of this will only happen if it's set. So now when I save this, this should all disappear. Or not. Oh. It is set, right? Let's refresh. That'll get rid of it. Continue. Oh, I need to get it to pull up without, there we go. So, right, it had been set because we had already clicked the submit button once, right? So now we go. Now we sent this out as a get statement. I just needed to come up here and hit enter on the URL again, and then that pulled it in as a get statement. So, this point now we have nothing in there. However, if I were to fill it in and put in like R and click submit, now I posted the rating R. Now it's not using that, it's still using PG. The last thing we need to do is actually use that rating in some way. So let me go ahead and get that out again, not refresh, let's just hit enter. And the first thing we'll do is grab the actual posted data. So we'll say request, let's just call the variable input rating. So that we know that this is the rating that was actually input to us, and it's going to be equal to $_post, and then we will do rating. We grab the actual information. This is right out of whatever got submitted from here. Now, let's do this unsafely at first, because we can. Let's just drop in input rating. That's very convenient, right? We just drop it in where we previously had PG. So if we go ahead and save this, this will reload, and let's put in something like R, submit, and there we go. It's now pulled out all the R-rated movies. There's 135 of those. There's more R-rated movies. Let's try PG-13. That's probably the most popular one. Oh, it's not. Only 65 of those. G gives us 21. PG was 71. So you can start to see here how this all works. PG is actually pretty unpopular. 71 versus, no, R is still the most popular, it looks like. I don't think there's any NC-17. Error, no rows returned. And that's because we gave it something that wasn't in the database. Nobody likes an NC-17 movie, at least not in mainstream. So there we go. Now, of course, this is susceptible to SQL injection now, isn't it? Let's take a look at this. Gonna have a little bit of fun here. Let's see, we selected title rated from movies where rated equals, and right there is where we are. Rated equals PG colon. So we're closing out now that area, and let's put in a semicolon and then say drop table movies. This is ballsy. Let's do it though. And then we need a dash dash and a space to make sure the rest gets out. This is the classic Bobby Tables example. Let's see what happens. You have an error in your SQL syntax. Check the manual that corresponds to your MySQL server version for the right syntax to use near drop table movies. Oh, okay, so we at least wound up with an error in there rather than anything critically bad. But you can see here that our query actually did take that stuff in and tried to do something. Not good news. So that's the danger of SQL injection. And if you use this naively, that's what can happen. So let's see the right way to do it. Instead of actually putting it in here, we're going to create a parameter just by putting a question mark. The question mark says, I'm going to give you a value here later. For now, just expect a value to come. And so when you run prepare, it thinks, okay, I've got one parameter coming later. Now we need to actually bind it. So we say if not, because we always start with that, so we're checking our statement, stmt-bind param, and then we need to give it two things. First, we give it a string that says what type it is. There's only one of them, so we say S for a string, and then we give it the actual value, which in this case will be input rating. And if that returns an error, then we need to say something about that. I'm going to grab this one down here because it's closer. We'll say parameter error and then put out the error itself because we're binding a parameter. Let's go ahead and save this. Now the error has changed to no rows returned. It accepted that rating and it decided that no, you're trying to grab a rating that you shouldn't, and it treats the whole thing as a rating. The actual query no longer gets mangled. So yeah, if we put in R, we still get the R movies. If we put in PG, we get the PG movies. If we put in PG drop table movies, it just says no rows returned. It doesn't mangle the query, which is what we want. So this is how we guard against SQL injection. It's a little bit of extra work, but conceptually it's not too difficult. This does get more complicated, of course, when there's multiple parameters, but we won't really be going down that road in this class. And when we do, I'll try and make sure that you know exactly how to do it. It's just a little bit more complex of a call.